The winter of 1944 was bitter and gray across the English countryside. On the sprawling airfields of East Anglia, the U.S. 8th Air Force prepared for yet another day of war. The men of the bomber groups were young, tired, and far from home. They had seen friends go up into the morning mist and never return. Their task was simple in words, but nearly impossible in reality. Fly deep into Nazi Germany, destroy its factories and cities, and somehow make it back alive. The trouble was, the enemy skies were waiting for them. German fighters, Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, stood ready beyond the Rhine, and there was only so far American fighters could go before fuel forced them to turn back. Beyond that invisible line, bombers were alone, their only protection the tight formation of wings and the desperate spray of their own machine guns. The P-51 Mustang had changed much of that equation. It was a masterpiece of engineering, sleek, powerful, and deadly. It could dive, climb, and outfight almost anything in the sky. But even the best airplane is useless if it cannot reach the fight. The Mustang's internal fuel tanks could only take it so far. Once it ran low, it had to peel away, leaving the bombers exposed just when they needed it most. Every airman knew what that meant. A mission to Berlin was like drawing a card from death's deck. The statistics told the story. Losses were staggering. Entire crews vanished. And though replacements came quickly, morale was crumbling under the weight of impossible odds. The commanders of the 8th Air Force faced a cruel arithmetic. They had the bombers. They had the fighters. They had courage. But courage burned fuel, and no amount of bravery could make a tank last longer than physics allowed. The air war over Europe was becoming a test not just of strength, but of endurance and ingenuity. Somewhere, someone would have to find a way to stretch that range, to bridge that final deadly gap between safety and Berlin. Across the Atlantic, in the industrial towns and quiet workshops of Britain, the answer was already beginning to take shape. It wouldn't come from a weapons lab or a military think tank. It would come from an unlikely place, a paper factory. The Bowater-Lloyd Paper Company, known for making everything from newsprint to packaging, suddenly found itself faced with an unusual challenge. The Ministry of Aircraft Production had asked them to do something few could even imagine: build a fuel tank out of paper. The engineers were skeptical at first. Paper was for newspapers, not airplanes. The idea sounded absurd, but the shortage of aluminum had become critical, and metal drop tanks, external fuel tanks mounted under aircraft wings, were expensive and scarce. What if there was another way? Paper was abundant, lightweight, and cheap. With the right treatment, perhaps it could be made strong enough to hold aviation fuel for a few hours, just long enough to do the job. So, they began to experiment. Sheets of laminated craft paper were bonded together with phenolic resin, layer by layer, forming a sturdy shell. The result was surprisingly robust: a 108-gallon tank, waterproof and durable, yet light enough to carry easily. The design was simple. It didn't have to last long. It didn't have to survive battle. It only had to get the plane there and back. Once empty, pilots could jettison it before entering combat. In a world of steel and fire, something as fragile as paper was about to change everything. The Bowater-Lloyd team refined the process quickly. Newspaper printing facilities were converted into wartime production lines. Machines that once rolled out daily news now pressed layers of resin-soaked paper into curved molds. The smell of glue and varnish filled the air. Workers, many of them women, labored around the clock, assembling tanks by hand. Every seam had to be sealed perfectly, every curve inspected. The finished products were tested, filled, drained, and stacked by the hundreds, ready to be shipped to air bases where the Mustangs waited. At first, pilots laughed. The idea of flying into combat with a paper fuel tank sounded ridiculous. Paper, some said. You expect me to bet my life on that? But the numbers didn't lie. Each tank carried an additional 108 gallons of fuel. Two of them, one under each wing, added hundreds of miles to the Mustang's range. That meant the fighters could now accompany bombers all the way to Berlin, fight their way through, and still have enough to get home. Suddenly, what had seemed impossible became achievable. When the first missions launched with paper drop tanks attached, few could predict the scale of the transformation that was about to unfold. The squadrons took off from East Anglia in the pale morning light, the vapor trails of bombers stretching across the sky. Below, the green and brown fields of England faded into the gray expanse of the Channel. Beyond that, occupied Europe waited. As the bombers crossed into German airspace, the Mustangs stayed with them, longer than ever before. When they reached the usual point of return, they kept going. German radar operators watching their screens were baffled. The enemy fighters scrambled, expecting the escorts to peel away as always, but they didn't. The American fighters were still there, waiting for them. What followed was a shockwave across the Luftwaffe. Suddenly, the hunters had become the hunted. The Mustangs dove into dogfights over Germany's heartland. They strafed airfields, intercepted interceptors, and covered the bombers all the way to Berlin. For the first time, the U.S. Air Force could strike at the Reich's capital with full fighter support. Losses among bomber crews began to drop. Missions that once seemed suicidal now had real chances of success. The German pilots, once confident in their home advantage, found themselves cornered in their own skies. The psychological impact was immense. Reports from downed Luftwaffe officers captured after missions revealed disbelief. They couldn't understand how the Americans had done it. Some suspected new types of aircraft or secret bases. The truth was far simpler and far more humbling. It was paper. The success of the paper fuel tank was not just a technical triumph, but a testament to wartime creativity. It showed that innovation could come from anywhere, even from something as humble as a sheet of paper. The Bowater-Lloyd engineers had transformed an everyday material into a weapon of strategic significance, and in doing so, they gave Allied pilots the reach they needed to win the war in the air. In the months that followed, production skyrocketed. Thousands of tanks rolled out of factories each week. They were stacked in depots, loaded onto trucks, and distributed to airfields across Britain. Mechanics learned to attach and test them quickly. Pilots grew to trust them, calling them their tickets home. Some even decorated them with nose art or messages before missions, a quiet tribute to the odd little invention that kept them alive. Each mission became a demonstration of the paper tank's value. Over the skies of Germany, streams of silver bombers were now flanked by fighters that could stay until the job was done. The strategic bombing campaign intensified. Railways, factories, and fuel depots fell under relentless attack. And as German defenses weakened, Allied forces on the ground prepared for the final push into Europe. By the spring of 1944, the skies over Europe had changed. The once invincible Luftwaffe was being pushed to the brink. American bombers could now fly deeper, longer, and with fewer losses. The paper drop tank had become an invisible ally, quietly attached beneath the wings of every Mustang that thundered down the runways of East Anglia. The pilots who once joked about it no longer laughed. They had seen what it could do. They had flown into Germany and come back to tell the tale. Colonel Don Blakesley, one of the 8th Air Force's most celebrated aces, later remarked that the Mustang's new range made the difference between fighting a war in the air and ending one. And he was right. The 108-gallon paper tank transformed the Mustang from a regional defender into a continent-crossing predator. It was a small change with enormous consequences. With every new mission, the psychological advantage shifted further toward the Allies. The men on the ground also knew what it meant. In the Bowater-Lloyd factory, production lines buzzed day and night. The rhythmic slap of brushes and rollers filled the air as women coated layers of craft paper with resin, shaping them into halves that would later be joined into full tanks. They worked fast but carefully. Any flaw could mean a leak, and a leak could cost a life. Every finished tank was inspected, pressure tested, and stamped before being loaded onto trucks. These workers may never have flown, but in a sense, their hands touched the war every day. In one corner of the factory, an engineer named Eric Morgan watched as a fresh batch of tanks was completed. He had been part of the early design team that wrestled with the problem of sealing the joints between the paper layers. Early prototypes leaked badly under pressure, but through trial and error and more than a few sleepless nights, the team found the right combination of resin and paper thickness to hold aviation fuel securely for hours of flight. It was like building a boat, Morgan recalled years later. Only the boat had to fly. The tanks were coated with a thin outer layer of waterproof varnish, giving them a smooth, almost waxy finish. Their weight was minimal, less than half of a metal tank of the same size. When empty, they could be jettisoned easily, falling away to earth like discarded shells. It was this simplicity that made them so effective. Nothing fancy, nothing complicated, just smart design in service of survival. Meanwhile, in briefing rooms across England, bomber crews and fighter pilots studied maps of Germany covered in pins and lines. Each pin represented a target. factories in Schweinfurt, oil refineries in Merseburg, rail yards in Leipzig, and, of course, Berlin itself. For months, those targets had been out of practical range for fighter escorts. Now, that was changing. The paper tanks gave commanders confidence to plan longer missions, to push deeper into enemy territory. When the first full Berlin escort mission was planned, there was tension in every corner of the airfields. Ground crews double-checked every fitting, every valve, every hose. Pilots knew they were attempting something historic. The morning of the mission was cold and clear. Engines roared to life, filling the air with thunder. Long lines of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators lifted off one by one, their silver wings glinting in the pale light. Above and behind them, the Mustangs rose to meet the dawn. Each carried 2 paper tanks beneath its wings, dull beige against the polished aluminum of the aircraft. As they climbed toward altitude, pilots monitored their fuel gauges carefully. The tanks fed into the main system through simple gravity flow. The resin paper shells swelled slightly as pressure built, but held firm. Once over the North Sea, they switched over fully to the drop tanks. The added range was immediately apparent. Normally, this was the point where Mustangs would start thinking about their return leg. This time, they pushed on. Over Germany, the radio chatter crackled to life as the first enemy contacts appeared. Dozens of black dots climbing fast, Messerschmitts scrambling to intercept. The American fighters didn't break off. They stayed with the bombers, throttling forward. The German pilots dove in, expecting to catch unescorted bombers as before, but instead they met a wall of Mustangs. Dogfights erupted across the sky, contrails twisting like ribbons. Fuel burned, guns roared, and the paper tanks were released, tumbling away into the clouds as the fighters engaged. When the formation finally turned home hours later, Berlin lay behind them in smoke and ruin. The mission had succeeded, and for the first time, the bombers returned with minimal losses. Word spread quickly through the ranks. The paper tanks had done their job perfectly. It was hard to overstate what that meant for morale. For bomber crews, the knowledge that they would not be abandoned halfway home was life-changing. It gave them a sense of security, of shared purpose. The fighter pilots, too, found new confidence. They could now hunt the Luftwaffe on its own ground, chasing enemy aircraft back to their bases, and even strafing runways before turning for home. By mid-1944, the tide of air superiority had clearly turned. German industrial production was collapsing under constant bombardment. Oil supplies dwindled. Training facilities were bombed relentlessly. Young Luftwaffe recruits were being sent into battle with barely any experience. And through it all, the P-51 Mustang, with its unlikely paper companions, ruled the skies. In post-war analysis, historians would point to many factors that led to Allied dominance in the air. Superior numbers, radar coordination, improved tactics. But among those, one quiet line item always stood out: the development of long-range external fuel tanks. Without them, the P-51 might have remained a short-range interceptor, a brilliant machine limited by its own endurance. With them, it became the instrument of victory. Even German intelligence recognized the shift. In intercepted communications, Luftwaffe officers noted that American fighters now remain with the bomber streams beyond Berlin. Some even speculated that the Americans had developed in-flight refueling, an idea far beyond reality at the time. The truth, when it was discovered, seemed almost insulting. They are using tanks of paper. The reaction was disbelief, then grudging admiration. In a war filled with advanced machines and deadly innovation, the notion that paper and glue had changed the balance of power was almost poetic. Meanwhile, Allied engineers continued to refine the design. Variants of the paper tank were adapted for other aircraft, including the P-47 Thunderbolt and even some British fighters. Each new version improved durability, sealant efficiency, and ease of production. The Bowater-Lloyd Company became a vital supplier to the Allied war effort. Their newspaper printing routes gave them the machinery and manpower to mass-produce what was essentially a printed product, only instead of ink and headlines, their presses rolled out victory. To the workers who made them, it was both strange and deeply meaningful. Many of them had brothers or husbands flying in those very missions. Every tank that left the factory might mean one of them would come home. The process was repetitive but sacred, mixing the resin, layering the paper, shaping the halves, sealing the seams. They became experts in a craft that had never existed before, and when the news came that the bombers had reached Berlin, many cried quietly at their benches. They had helped make it happen. The tanks themselves had a short life. Once dropped, they fell back to earth, often breaking apart on impact. In some cases, farmers in France or Belgium found the remnants, flattened, soggy shells that had once carried high-octane fuel across enemy lines. To them, they were strange relics, proof of something remarkable. Children sometimes played with the torn pieces, not realizing they were touching a small part of the weapon that had helped free Europe. The paper tanks became so commonplace that pilots began to forget how extraordinary they really were. They were just part of the routine now, fitted before each mission, checked for leaks, and then filled with the lifeblood of flight. Yet beneath that ordinariness lay one of the cleverest improvisations of the entire war. A solution born not from advanced laboratories, but from necessity, resourcefulness, and imagination. It was, in a way, the purest expression of wartime invention, taking what you had and making it work better than anyone thought possible. In the mess halls after missions, pilots traded stories of how far they'd gone, how deep into Germany they'd chased their opponents. The laughter was louder now, the tension lighter. Missions that once carried a 25% casualty rate were now coming home with nearly every aircraft intact. The bomber crews started to call their Mustang escorts angels because that's what they felt like. Angels appearing in the sky when death seemed certain. One pilot recalled seeing his escort still beside him even as they turned back over Berlin, and he realized for the first time that he might actually live to see another dawn. What made the paper tanks so powerful wasn't just the fuel they carried. It was what that fuel represented. Reach. In war, reach is everything. The ability to strike your enemy while remaining out of theirs changes not only tactics, but psychology. Germany had relied for years on the natural protection of distance. Deep within its borders, its industrial heart had felt untouchable. Now that illusion was gone. The Mustang's extended range meant there was no refuge. From the North Sea to the Elbe River, from Cologne to Dresden, the skies no longer belonged to the Luftwaffe. There were teething issues, of course. Early versions of the paper tank sometimes leaked under rapid pressure changes, especially at high altitudes. The fuel would seep through the seams and create a faint smell in the cockpit. Engineers quickly modified the sealant composition and improved the curing process. Later iterations were so well made that they could sit full for days without a drop escaping. It was a delicate balance. Make it too strong and the tank would be difficult to jettison. Too weak, and it might fail mid-flight. But the British engineers found that perfect middle ground. American maintenance crews learned to appreciate the tanks too. Unlike metal versions, they didn't dent easily or require complex welding. They could be stacked efficiently, transported in bulk, and even burned after use to prevent clutter on airfields. Commanders loved them because they were cheap and plentiful. The cost of one paper tank was less than a single hour of flight time in a Mustang. In a war measured in billions of dollars and millions of lives, that kind of efficiency was priceless. One interesting detail that often goes unnoticed is how these tanks subtly influenced Allied tactics. Because the paper tanks were disposable, pilots became more aggressive. They could afford to carry maximum fuel outward, drop the tanks before combat, and fight at full performance without worrying about getting home. This freedom of maneuver gave them a critical edge. Many Luftwaffe aces, accustomed to Allied escorts breaking away early, found themselves ambushed by Mustangs still brimming with fight. As one German pilot reportedly muttered after capture, "They never go home anymore. They stay and they hunt." By the summer of 1944, the effect was unmistakable. Bomber streams crossed the continent daily, and Allied air superiority became almost total. German production plants struggled to repair constant damage. Oil facilities in particular were devastated. Without fuel, the German war machine began to choke. Tanks couldn't move, planes couldn't fly, and training programs ground to a halt. What began as a small experiment in a paper factory had rippled outward to alter the entire course of the conflict. Meanwhile, at Bowater Lloyd, success brought both pride and exhaustion. The workers were producing thousands of tanks a week. The assembly lines hummed with relentless energy. Trucks rolled out at all hours, bound for ports and airfields. There were occasional shortages of resin, and when that happened, workers improvised, stretching supplies, sometimes reusing curing vats far beyond their normal lifespan. Nothing stopped the flow. Wartime Britain understood what was at stake. Visitors from the Ministry of Aircraft Production occasionally toured the plant, noting how newspaper machinery had been adapted to make weapons of war. One official later wrote that it was a site of quiet genius. The presses of free speech turned to the service of freedoms itself. The workers took that to heart. They weren't just printing stories anymore. they were helping write one. Pilots often sent thank you letters back to the factory. Some were brief, scrawled notes saying things like, "Your tanks got us there and home," or "Another Berlin trip. Your handiwork did it again." The letters were pinned to notice boards in the canteen where tired eyes could see them between shifts. It was a reminder that what they were building wasn't just paper and glue. It was life insurance, courage made tangible. There's a particular irony to how fragile the tanks looked compared to what they achieved. They were thin, almost flimsy to touch. A hard knock could dent them, a bullet could tear them apart. And yet, in their fragility, there was strength. They didn't need to last long. Their purpose was transient, ephemeral: carry, empty, release, vanish. They were like the missions themselves: dangerous, fleeting, necessary. By late 1944, the Allied bombing campaign had reached a new level of ferocity. Entire fleets of Mustangs, Thunderbolts, and Lightnings now escorted bombers with unbroken coverage. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe's skies, was running on fumes. Hitler's once proud Air Force had lost thousands of aircraft and, more critically, experienced pilots. New recruits were being shot down on their first missions. Airfields that had been safe zones were now targets themselves, strafed by Allied fighters after the bombing runs were complete. The Germans could no longer defend their skies. It was during this period that even German analysts acknowledged the devastating impact of the new Allied range. Reports sent to the Reich Air Ministry lamented that enemy fighters appear now over targets deep within the Reich and return unmolested. The word unmolested was key. It meant there was no longer a viable countermeasure. The Americans had found a way to bypass Germany's strategic depth, and there was no defense for it. The Allied commanders understood exactly what this meant. It wasn't just about bombing factories. It was about breaking the Luftwaffe's back, ensuring that when D-Day arrived and the invasion of Europe began, there would be no significant air resistance. In that sense, the paper drop tank played a direct role in paving the skies for the liberation of France and eventually the fall of Berlin itself. Pilots noticed the change most of all. They could now see the results of their missions: the reduced flak, the fewer enemy fighters, the growing confidence of the bomber crews. Many veterans would later say that the paper tank was one of those small, almost invisible miracles that made survival possible. "It was like carrying hope under your wings," one recalled. "You didn't think about it much, but you knew it was there." Even as victory neared, the production of paper tanks didn't slow down. If anything, it increased. The Allied advance required constant air cover, and the longer the front lines stretched, the more range was needed. By early 1945, the Mustang was flying missions into the very heart of collapsing Germany, its paper tanks ensuring that even the farthest targets could be reached. It's easy, in hindsight, to overlook the humble objects that shape history. We remember the planes, the generals, the great battles. But wars are won by details, by the quiet inventions that bridge the gap between what is and what must be. The paper fuel tank was one of those details: fragile, disposable, and yet indispensable. It turned the Mustang into what pilots affectionately called the Cadillac of the skies, a machine that could go anywhere and do anything. The idea of something so simple becoming so vital struck many who studied the war in later years as profoundly symbolic. The paper fuel tank represented everything about the Allied approach to victory: adaptability, cooperation, and a kind of pragmatic creativity that turned ordinary materials into extraordinary solutions. While the Axis powers often chased perfection through complexity, the Allies learned to innovate through simplicity. The tank didn't need to be beautiful or enduring. It just had to work once, perfectly, and in doing so, save lives. The collaboration between American and British minds was another key to its success. On one side, American engineers had created a fighter unmatched in speed, agility, and firepower. On the other, British craftsmen and chemists found a way to extend that fighter's reach. It was an alliance of necessity that reflected the larger partnership between the two nations: practical, sometimes messy, but unstoppable. Both sides understood that victory would not come from any single genius or invention, but from the combined weight of countless ideas, each adding a piece to the puzzle. In interviews conducted decades later, surviving members of the Bowater-Lloyd team recalled their initial disbelief when told what their product would be used for. "We were papermen, not engineers," one of them said. "We thought they were mad." But as the first reports came back from the airfields, Mustangs flying farther than ever, missions reaching Berlin, their skepticism melted into pride. Each new order from the ministry was celebrated with quiet satisfaction. They were helping end the war, one roll of craft paper at a time. And it wasn't just the engineers or the factory workers who appreciated what they'd achieved. The pilots knew, the ground crews knew, even the top brass knew. At briefings, commanders would point to range maps showing how far their fighters could now go, the circles of coverage stretching deeper into Germany each week. Those maps told a story of shrinking distance and growing power, the gradual erasure of the Luftwaffe's safe zones. What had once been an ocean of hostile airspace was now a battlefield under Allied control. The missions that followed were some of the most daring of the war. Escorting bombers to targets such as Leipzig, Hamburg, and Munich became almost routine. Pilots would joke that the only limit now was how long they could sit in their cockpits. But beneath the humor was an understanding of how miraculous this transformation was. Only months before, such missions would have been suicide runs. Now, they were strategic operations executed with precision and confidence. One of the most significant moments came during Big Week in February 1944, a series of massive Allied bombing raids designed to cripple the German aircraft industry. The Mustangs, equipped with their paper tanks, played a crucial role. They escorted bombers all the way to the targets and stayed to fight off the interceptors. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had into the defense, but it was not enough. The Allied losses were heavy, but the German losses were devastating. Factories that built Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs were reduced to rubble. The air war turned decisively in the Allies' favor. Reports from that period often mention the surreal sight of paper tanks tumbling from the sky as fighters released them before battle. At high altitude, the discarded tanks would catch the sunlight, spinning like falling leaves, glittering for a moment before disappearing into the clouds below. It was a strange beauty in the midst of violence, thousands of small, fragile objects marking the edge between endurance and combat. After Big Week, the Mustangs became the spearhead of every major air operation in Europe. With the new tanks, they could accompany bombers to the most distant corners of the Reich, then sweep low on the return leg to strafe trains, trucks, and convoys. The German infrastructure began to collapse. Even the mighty panzer divisions could no longer move freely, their supply lines shredded by fighter attacks. On the ground, civilians sometimes found the remains of the jettisoned tanks. Farmers would pick up the crumpled pieces, puzzled at first, then realizing they were part of the Allied war machine. Some used the fragments as makeshift buckets or patched roofs with them. To them, these discarded shells were more than debris. They were signs of liberation approaching. In England, meanwhile, the Bowater-Lloyd Company had become a model of wartime production. Their newspaper facilities now churned out fuel tanks instead of print. The process was so efficient that government officials began exploring whether similar paper composites could be used for other temporary military equipment, even life rafts and storage containers. While most of these ideas never reached full production, they demonstrated the expanding faith in lightweight disposable materials, a precursor to the modern world of composite engineering. The irony wasn't lost on those involved. A few years earlier, no one would have imagined that newspapers, the very symbols of communication and information, would one day become physical tools of war. The same presses that once printed headlines about the Blitz were now quietly crafting the instruments that would help end it. In a sense, the Bowater-Lloyd tanks were a bridge between words and deeds, between the story of war and its resolution. As 1945 dawned, the Allies' grip on the air was absolute. German cities lay in ruins, their factories silent, their railways crippled. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was reduced to a shadow force. Hitler's last hope, the jet-powered Me-262, arrived too late and in too few numbers to make a difference. The Mustangs hunted even those, their long range allowing them to patrol airfields and destroy jets before they could take off. Every mission, every victory, carried within it a trace of that humble paper invention. Veterans would later recall how natural it seemed by then to have external tanks. They couldn't imagine flying without them, yet they never forgot that the simplest tools can often be the most decisive. "You don't think about it much when you're flying," one pilot said decades later, "but every time I saw those tanks being attached, I knew someone's hands had made them, somewhere. It made you feel connected, like the whole world was holding you up." That sense of connection between factory worker and fighter pilot, between engineer and airman, was one of the quiet victories of the war. It reminded everyone involved that winning wasn't just about machines or tactics. It was about collaboration, a shared will to survive and succeed. The paper tank became a symbol of that unity. It represented how different skills, trades, and minds could come together across oceans to solve a single, deadly problem. Even after the war, the memory of those paper tanks lingered. Some were displayed in museums, others preserved in technical archives. Engineers studied them as early examples of composite construction. They were crude by modern standards, but revolutionary for their time. In them, we can see the first glimmers of a future where material science would redefine what was possible, from fiberglass boats to carbon fiber aircraft. It's astonishing to think that a weapon born out of desperation could lead to such far-reaching innovation. But that's the legacy of the paper fuel tank. It wasn't just a tool of war, it was a step toward the future. When the war finally ended in May 1945, Europe was a continent scarred beyond recognition. Cities lay in ruins, millions were displaced, and the world was left to reckon with what it had endured. Amid the rubble and the rebuilding, stories began to surface, stories not only of heroism and sacrifice, but of innovation and collaboration. The tale of the paper fuel tank was one of them. It was not the kind of story that made front-page headlines, yet it carried a quiet power of its own. In the early post-war months, Allied engineers took stock of the technologies that had carried them to victory. Jet propulsion, radar, and atomic research dominated the discussions. But tucked away in those reports were notes about composite auxiliary fuel tanks, their performance rated as exceptional. For the men who had flown with them, those notes felt too small, too clinical. To them, the tanks had meant something more. They had meant survival. At the air bases of East Anglia, where the Mustangs had once launched their long, perilous missions, the runways were now quiet. Rows of planes sat idle, their paper tanks removed, their engines silent. Ground crews who had worked through endless nights now packed up their tools and returned home. The war was over, but the memories would never leave them. Many pilots would keep pieces of their aircraft as mementos, a control stick, a patch of fuselage, even a small section of a paper tank if they could find one intact. These fragile remnants became symbols of a time when everything, even paper, could be turned into a weapon if the cause was right. In Britain, the WWII company gradually returned to peacetime production. The presses that had printed victory had once again begun printing words. But the factory walls still bore traces of the war effort, scorch marks from resin curing, faint outlines on the floor where molds once stood. For years afterward, older workers would tell new apprentices about the time they made tanks instead of newsprint, about how something as ordinary as paper had helped win a world war. It became part of the company's lore, a quiet chapter of industrial courage. Historians studying the air war began to take a renewed interest in such stories during the 1950s and 1960s. They saw in the paper tank a symbol of the kind of lateral thinking that had characterized the Allied victory. It was an approach that favored adaptability over perfection, teamwork over ego. When resources were limited and time was short, engineers had chosen to innovate rather than despair. The lesson resonated far beyond the battlefield. In the post-war years, the principles behind the paper tank would influence a new generation of material scientists. The idea of using layered, bonded materials to achieve strength and flexibility found its way into early fiberglass designs and later into carbon composites. Engineers studying the Mustang's auxiliary tanks realized that the method of layering thin materials under pressure could be adapted to create lightweight structures in aviation, automotive design, and even space exploration. In a strange way, the WWII factory had helped open the door to the modern age of composites. But for the veterans who had lived through it, the innovation remained deeply personal. In interviews, many spoke of the emotional connection they felt to that small piece of ingenuity. One recalled flying over the gray sprawl of Germany and looking down at his paper tanks, knowing they carried him through the most dangerous skies on Earth. "It wasn't fancy," he said, "but it worked. It did what it had to do. That's all we needed." It was an attitude shared by the thousands who fought the war, an understanding that sometimes the smallest tools could make the greatest difference. The paper tank was not glamorous. It didn't roar like an engine or flash like a gun. It was quiet, unassuming, and fleeting. Yet without it, the war in the air might have dragged on far longer, and countless more lives might have been lost. As peace settled over Europe, the old airfields began to vanish beneath grass and farmland. The control towers crumbled, the hangars were dismantled, and the runways cracked under the rain. But even as the landscape changed, the stories remained. Locals remembered the thunder of the Mustangs, the endless convoys of trucks carrying paper tanks, the hum of industry that filled their once quiet towns. In small museums and local archives, photographs of those days were carefully preserved, snapshots of workers in headscarves applying resin to paper, of pilots grinning beside their aircraft, of tanks stacked like enormous rolls of parchment waiting for their turn to fly. In the decades that followed, a handful of the surviving paper tanks found their way into museums. At first, curators were unsure what to do with them. They were fragile, easily damaged, and not nearly as striking as the aircraft they once supported. But gradually, historians began to realize their importance. They represented not just a piece of military hardware, but a philosophy. The idea that creativity, even in its simplest form, can win wars. One of the most touching tributes came from a group of British and American veterans who met in the 1970s to commemorate the Mustang's service. Among them was a former WWII engineer who had helped develop the tanks. When the pilots realized who he was, they stood and applauded. "You're the man who got us there," one said. The engineer, now in his 70s, simply smiled and replied, "No, I just helped you get home." As technology marched on, the materials changed, but the principle remained. Every generation of aircraft since has relied on external fuel systems designed for maximum efficiency and range. From the jet fighters of the Cold War to the stealth planes of today, the concept of lightweight, detachable tanks has become standard. In that sense, the paper fuel tank lives on, not in form, but in spirit, the ancestor of every innovation that dares to rethink the obvious. It's strange to imagine now, in an age of advanced alloys and digital precision, that something so simple once carried the fate of a war. Yet perhaps that's the real power of the story. It reminds us that progress is not always about sophistication. Sometimes it's about courage, the courage to try something that seems absurd, to look at a problem and say, "What if?" The paper fuel tank was born of that question, and in answering it, it helped bring the war to an end. As historians pieced together the story, they often marveled at the contrast between the materials and the mission. Paper and glue, the most fragile of substances, were used to protect the most valuable cargo of all: human lives. It was a paradox, but one that fit perfectly within the broader story of the war. So much of that era was defined by extremes: destruction and creation, fear and bravery, fragility and strength. The paper tank, in its quiet way, embodied all of it. Even today, when visitors stand in front of the few surviving examples in museums, they often lean closer, almost disbelieving. "Paper," they whisper. It doesn't seem possible. But then they read the placard, the missions flown, the distances covered, the lives saved, and realization dawns. This wasn't just paper. It was innovation under fire. It was proof that imagination could be as powerful as any bomb or bullet. For many of the pilots who flew with those tanks, the memory of that time never faded. Even decades later, when they spoke about their missions, they could recall every detail: the smell of fuel, the vibration of the engine, the moment when the tanks were released and fell away. Some said they could still hear the faint hollow clatter as the tanks separated from the wings, spinning down into the clouds below. It was a sound that meant freedom, freedom from the weight of fuel, from the long reach of danger, from the fear of not making it home. It was the sound of survival. One veteran, Captain Arthur Red Lane, described his first mission to Berlin. "We'd been told we might make it all the way," he said in an interview years later, "but we didn't believe it. We'd heard that before. Then we crossed the border, and the gauges still looked good. We kept going. Next thing I know, someone says, 'That's Berlin below us.' I couldn't believe it. I looked down at those paper tanks and just laughed. Paper. But that paper got me there." Stories like Lane's spread far and wide after the war. They became a kind of folklore among aviators, reminders of a time when ingenuity had turned the tide. Younger pilots raised in the jet age listened with disbelief. They were surrounded by technology: radar, missiles, advanced alloys, and it was hard to imagine a world where survival depended on something as fragile as laminated craft paper. But that was the beauty of the story. It showed how resourcefulness could triumph where resources were scarce. In the years that followed, the WWII design became a case study in wartime efficiency. Economists and engineers studied it as an example of cost-effectiveness under extreme pressure. The entire production process had been streamlined to near perfection. Raw paper entered one end of the factory, and finished, resin-hardened tanks emerged from the other within hours. There were no wasted steps, no excess. It was wartime production at its purest, functional, fast, and focused entirely on results. What made the design truly remarkable was that it was never meant to last. It was disposable, intended for a single flight. That was its strength. By rejecting durability, the engineers had embraced practicality. In a war where every pound of metal mattered, paper had become a strategic resource. It freed up aluminum for aircraft, steel for ships, copper for wiring. Every paper tank that replaced a metal one meant more planes in the sky, more bombs on target, more missions completed. The tanks were expendable, but the lives they saved were not. There were, of course, moments of failure. Not every tank was perfect. A few leaked under pressure, others delaminated after rough handling. But those incidents were rare, and the lessons learned from them improved each new batch. The engineers were relentless in their pursuit of reliability. They tested the tanks under freezing conditions, soaked them in fuel for days, even shot holes in them to see how they behaved under fire. The results were consistent. The tanks performed far better than anyone had expected. As Allied air operations expanded across Europe in 1945, the Mustang's reputation reached legendary status. Pilots adored it, calling it the best aircraft they had ever flown. Its combination of speed, range, and maneuverability was unmatched. German aces who faced it in combat respected it, even feared it. Some later admitted that once the Mustangs began appearing deep inside German territory, they knew the end was near. The Luftwaffe simply couldn't match the Mustang's endurance. Back in Britain, the Bowater-Lloyd team followed the progress of the war through radio reports and newspaper headlines, many printed on the same presses that once made their tanks. They took quiet pride in each new victory, knowing that their work had played a small but vital part. There were no medals for them, no parades, but their contribution was written in the contrails that crossed the skies of Europe. After the war, a few of the engineers moved into the emerging aerospace industry. They carried with them the lessons they had learned during those frantic years, that strength didn't always come from hardness, and that innovation often begins with asking the simplest question. One of them later helped develop early fiberglass components for civil aviation, crediting the wartime paper tank project as his inspiration. "It taught us to think lighter," he said, "to see materials not for what they are, but for what they could be." The impact of the paper tank also extended into military strategy. The success of long-range escort missions convinced air forces around the world of the necessity of extended-range fighters. It reshaped doctrines of air combat and strategic bombing, laying the groundwork for post-war aviation strategy. Without that innovation, the Allied bombing campaign might never have achieved the dominance that broke Germany's war machine. Yet, as the decades passed, the story faded from public memory. History has a way of celebrating the spectacular, the dogfights, the heroics, the famous aircraft, while overlooking the quiet inventions that made them possible. For many years, the paper tank was little more than a footnote in aviation history, mentioned only in technical manuals and engineering reports. But among those who understood its significance, it remained a legend whispered with admiration. In the 1980s, when historians began revisiting the logistics of the air war, renewed attention was given to the overlooked innovations of World War II. The paper tank reemerged as one of those unsung marvels. Aviation museums began restoring examples for display, and documentaries featured interviews with surviving engineers and pilots. Audiences were amazed to learn that paper and glue had carried planes across the skies of Germany. For a new generation, it became a symbol of the ingenuity that had defined the greatest generation. At the Imperial War Museum in Duxford, a restored P-51 Mustang now hangs with two replica 108-gallon paper tanks beneath its wings. Visitors stand in awe, reading the placard that explains their history. Many can hardly believe it. Children press their hands to the glass, staring at the dull brown texture of the tanks, and ask their parents, "Did they really fly with that?" And the parents nod, just as incredulous, marveling at the courage it must have taken to trust such a thing. One former pilot, invited to the museum's opening ceremony, stood quietly before the display. When asked what he felt seeing those tanks again, he smiled faintly. "They look small," he said. "Smaller than I remember. But when you're 23 years old, sitting over enemy territory with a sky full of flak, they feel like the biggest things in the world." There's something deeply human about that memory, that sense of gratitude for a simple invention that bridged the impossible. It wasn't just an engineering success, it was an emotional one. It gave men a chance to come home. It allowed them to believe that the odds weren't unbeatable. and it proved that even in the darkest times, creativity can shine through. Long after the guns had fallen silent, the story of the paper fuel tank lived on in the memories of those who understood what it had meant. It was not a grand invention like the jet engine or radar, but it had done something few of those could. It had bridged the gap between survival and loss. In the archives of the U.S. Air Force and the British Ministry of Aircraft Production, memos and diagrams still showed the simplicity of the idea. A handful of engineers, a few sheets of paper, resin, and imagination. That was all it took to change the fate of missions that once seemed impossible. The engineers who worked on the design often spoke of the early prototypes, the experiments that failed before success was achieved. In one account, a group of technicians at a small testing range filled an early tank with aviation fuel and left it in the rain overnight. The next morning, they returned to find the tank swollen, misshapen, and leaking from several seams. The smell of fuel filled the air, and the paper had softened like wet cardboard. Most would have abandoned the idea then, but not them. They began to adjust the resin mixture, altering drying times and layer thicknesses until the tanks could endure both moisture and vibration. Every setback was a step closer to perfection. It wasn't just the physical materials that made it work, it was the mindset. Wartime Britain thrived on improvisation. Every shortage forced new creativity. In this environment, what seemed crazy at first glance could become crucial overnight. The paper tank was one of countless examples of what some historians now call necessity engineering, the art of solving critical problems with whatever was at hand. It was the same mindset that produced inflatable decoy tanks, radar made from salvaged parts, and cooking grease turned into explosives. Each invention, no matter how humble, played a role in the greater tapestry of victory. For pilots, the tanks became as familiar as their sidearms. They trusted them, even grew fond of them. Each morning before a mission, ground crews would attach the tanks, check the fuel lines, and wipe away any dust or rain. The pilots would give them a quick glance during takeoff, watching the reflection of sunlight on the varnished paper surface. It became a ritual, a moment of reassurance. In the vast machinery of war, small rituals kept men grounded. The missions themselves grew bolder. The long-range Mustangs began to reach cities that had once been untouchable. Berlin, Dresden, and Leipzig all fell within range. The Germans called the new escort pattern the steel curtain, though they didn't realize it was paper that made it possible. Every bomber formation that passed unscathed through German airspace was a silent tribute to the invention's success. In late 1944, a British journalist embedded with an American air group wrote a short dispatch about the paper tanks. It appeared in a London newspaper with the headline, "The Paper That Flies." The article described how ordinary newsprint factories were now turning out equipment that carried aircraft across the continent. It captured the public imagination. Letters poured into Beau Water-Lloyd from readers wanting to know if it was true. Could paper really carry fuel? The factory issued a brief statement confirming it, but details remained secret until after the war. The secrecy was necessary. Military intelligence feared that if the Germans learned how the tanks were made, they might target the supply lines or attempt to replicate them. But in truth, replication was difficult. The specific resin formula, the layering process, and the curing methods had been carefully refined. Even if the enemy tried, they likely wouldn't have achieved the same reliability. It was one of those rare moments when simplicity was paradoxically sophisticated. Among the pilots, the tanks inspired a mixture of amusement and awe. Some decorated them before missions, scrawling messages or doodles across the paper surface. "To Berlin and back," one wrote in black ink. Another painted a crude image of Hitler's face with a dart through it. These makeshift artworks rarely survived. Once the tanks were dropped, they vanished forever. But they added a personal touch to an otherwise mechanical war. The tanks also changed how missions were planned. Commanders could now schedule multiple bombing runs per week instead of spacing them out to account for losses and fatigue. With the Mustangs providing continuous escort, bomber groups operated with new confidence. Intelligence officers noticed that morale improved significantly once long-range coverage became consistent. Fewer crews refused missions, and anxiety dropped. The fear of the dead zone, that unescorted stretch over Germany, had been erased. By the time Allied troops crossed the Rhine in early 1945, the paper tank had already achieved what its creators had hoped for. It had rendered the Luftwaffe powerless in defense of its own homeland. German pilots could no longer hide behind range limitations. Every airfield, every supply line, every industrial hub was within reach. The Mustang had become the long arm of Allied air power, and its strength rested on those fragile wings of laminated paper. In post-war Germany, when Allied investigators examined captured documents, they found several references to the extended range of American fighters. German intelligence analysts had been baffled by the change. Their reports speculated about new fuel-efficient engines or hidden bases in France. One analyst even proposed that the Americans had discovered a new synthetic fuel. None guessed the truth. The simplicity of it defied their expectations. It is strange how war often hides its most profound truths in plain sight. For all their complexity and destruction, wars are sometimes turned by the simplest of ideas. A new angle, a lighter material, a shorter line on a map. That's all it takes. The paper fuel tank stands as a perfect example of this. It didn't require genius on the scale of Einstein or Turing. It required persistence, practicality, and belief that even fragile things could make a difference. When peace finally returned, those qualities carried over into civilian life. Many of the people who had worked on wartime innovations brought their skills into the rebuilding of Europe. The engineers who had once designed fuel tanks began creating packaging, vehicles, and even furniture using similar composite materials. The same techniques that once served war now served peace. The paper tank in that way became a bridge, not only between countries but between eras. In the United States, the P-51 Mustang went on to serve in Korea and in air forces around the world. Its legend endured, but few of those later pilots ever knew about the strange paper invention that had first given it its wings of endurance. Yet every time a Mustang roared into the sky, part of that legacy flew with it. As the decades rolled by, the paper fuel tank became a forgotten marvel to most, tucked away in dusty archives and engineering textbooks. Yet among historians and aviation enthusiasts, it gained a kind of cult admiration, a symbol of the unglamorous ingenuity that wins wars. Every great conflict has its heroes and its machines, but behind them are the inventions that quietly made heroism possible. The WWII paper tank belonged to that lineage, the invisible ally, the overlooked miracle. In the years following the war, aviation advanced rapidly. Jet aircraft replaced propeller-driven planes, and new fuels, alloys, and designs took flight. But even as the world leaped forward, the principles that gave birth to the paper tank continued to echo through the industry. Lightweight, disposable, cost-effective. Those three qualities became mantras for engineers designing everything from fuel pods to reconnaissance drones. What had begun as a desperate wartime improvisation had become the foundation of modern aerospace efficiency. The people who had lived through it never forgot. At reunions of Mustang squadrons held in the 1950s and 1960s, the topic would sometimes resurface over drinks and laughter. Veterans would tease each other about the first time they saw those odd brown tanks under their wings. "I thought they'd fall apart on takeoff," one would say, and the others would chuckle. But behind the humor lay gratitude. They all knew those flimsy-looking tanks had carried them through the deadliest skies in history. One veteran recalled a moment late in the war when he flew back over the North Sea after a long escort mission. His fuel gauges were low, the tanks long gone, but the setting sun caught something in the waves below. Dozens of jettisoned tanks bobbing on the water, reflecting gold and crimson light. "They looked beautiful," he said, "like a trail showing us the way home." The image stayed with him for the rest of his life. For the workers who built them, the tanks represented not just a product, but a purpose. Many of them had endured the hardships of the Blitz, rationing and separation from loved ones. Making something that directly helped the war effort gave their days meaning. One woman who worked at the WWII factory later said, "It was strange, really. We were used to printing newspapers, words, stories, politics. Then one day we were told we'd be making something to carry planes to Germany. We didn't quite understand at first, but when we heard that the boys were flying farther, that fewer were being lost, well, we knew it mattered." Inside the factories, conditions were tough. Resin fumes filled the air, and the process was labor-intensive. Workers stood for long hours, pressing, gluing, sealing, and inspecting. The tanks were large, unwieldy, and required precision. One mistake could mean a leak in flight. Yet despite the monotony and the fatigue, there was pride in every finished piece. The tanks were stamped with small identification marks, codes indicating where and when they were made. Some of these codes still survive on the preserved examples in museums, silent signatures of the people who built them. After the war, when the presses returned to printing newspapers, the workers noticed how light the old production seemed by comparison. One of them said, "It felt strange to print words again instead of making something that could fly." But that too was part of the healing, returning to normal life after years of transforming paper into armor. In the broader story of World War II, the paper tank's influence rippled outward. It demonstrated that the front line wasn't always a trench or a cockpit. It could be a workshop, a design studio, or a factory floor. The collaboration between industry and military during the war created an unprecedented exchange of ideas. Civilian industries that had never before been involved in warfare suddenly found themselves essential to it. Companies that made cars, radios, or even wallpaper adapted their machinery to produce weapons and tools of survival. The Bowater-Lloyd paper tank stood as a perfect example of how versatility could become a weapon all its own. What makes the story particularly powerful is how modest it remains. There was no fanfare when the tanks were introduced, no grand announcement or propaganda campaign. The public didn't even know they existed until after the war. They didn't look impressive or intimidating. They weren't built to last or to be admired. And yet, through them, thousands of pilots and airmen were able to see their homes again. Their purpose was fulfilled quietly, perfectly, and then discarded, just like the tanks themselves. Historians often draw parallels between the paper tank and the broader spirit of the Allied war effort. Where the Axis powers invested heavily in complex, resource-intensive technologies, the Allies focused on adaptability. They reused, reimagined, and repurposed. The British called it make do and mend, but it was more than that. It was a philosophy of survival. The paper tank embodied that idea to perfection. It was not the strongest, but it was strong enough. Not the most durable, but durable enough. It existed precisely as long as it needed to. By the late 20th century, a few surviving members of the Bowater-Lloyd engineering team began to share their experiences publicly. They appeared in interviews, wrote letters to aviation journals, and spoke at museums. Their accounts shed new light on how quickly the project had developed, mere weeks from concept to production. They also revealed the skepticism they faced. "We had officers come through who couldn't believe it," one engineer recalled. "They'd poke at the paper and say, 'You're joking, right?' But then we'd show them the test results and their faces would change." The process itself was elegant in its simplicity. Long rolls of craft paper were fed through rollers that coated them with a resin solution. The paper was then layered in molds, usually 8 to 12 sheets thick, before being pressed and baked in large curing ovens. The resulting shells were cut, joined, and sealed, with fittings for valves and lines added at the end. Each tank took less than a day to make, and because they required no metal, they could be produced in enormous quantities without disrupting other military supply chains. What the engineers didn't fully realize at the time was how far ahead of their era they were. They had effectively created one of the world's first large-scale composite manufacturing operations. The same techniques they used, layering, bonding, curing, would later form the backbone of advanced materials technology in aerospace and beyond. From the Concorde's fiberglass panels to the carbon fiber structures of modern aircraft, echoes of Bowater-Lloyd's wartime ingenuity can still be found. It's humbling to think that so much modern progress can trace its lineage back to a moment of desperation in the 1940s, when an engineer looked at a roll of paper and saw potential instead of limitation. That moment of imagination, simple, practical, and daring, became a turning point in the history of aviation. By the time the world began to rebuild itself in the late 1940s, the Bowater-Lloyd paper fuel tank had already faded quietly into legend. In the rush to move forward, few people thought about the strange, lightweight containers that once hung beneath the wings of the Mustang. Factories returned to printing newspapers and packaging, airfields were abandoned, and the memory of the paper tank drifted into obscurity. But for the men who had relied on them, it remained unforgettable, a strange, almost unbelievable artifact of ingenuity that had meant the difference between life and death. One of the remarkable things about the paper tank story is how it encapsulated the spirit of Allied cooperation. Britain provided the idea, the materials, and the craftsmanship. America provided the aircraft, the pilots, and the missions. Together, they created a synergy that neither could have achieved alone. This partnership mirrored the broader alliance that had carried the war to victory, a blending of imagination and muscle, creativity and production. It wasn't about who got the credit. It was about what worked. In many ways, the tank was as much a product of faith as it was of engineering. Faith that something so simple could withstand the rigors of war. Faith that workers in a paper factory could produce something as vital as a fighter's lifeline. Faith that the pilots would trust it when they needed it most. That faith paid off in every successful mission, every bomber that reached its target, and every airman who lived to see another sunrise. For those on the front lines, that trust wasn't given lightly. At first, many pilots were deeply skeptical. They had seen too many good men lost to technical failures, and the idea of flying with paper tanks sounded like madness. Yet, once they saw the results, once they made it home after a mission that would have otherwise been impossible, their skepticism vanished. Soon, the tanks became just another part of the Mustang's silhouette, as natural and essential as its wings. The German pilots, too, began to notice. Luftwaffe reconnaissance teams took photographs of downed Mustangs and puzzled over the strange material of their auxiliary tanks. Some even suspected they were made of an experimental plastic. The idea that they were paper seemed absurd. "It cannot be," one German engineer reportedly remarked when shown a captured example. "This is a child's toy, not an aircraft part." And yet it had helped destroy the Luftwaffe's dominance. The Bowater-Lloyd factory continued to operate deep into 1945, even as victory grew certain. Orders kept coming until the very last months of the war. Production only slowed after Germany's surrender in May, when the flow of missions finally ceased. Workers who had spent years coating and curing paper shells suddenly found themselves idle, unsure of what came next. Some felt pride, others felt an emptiness that comes after great effort ends. They had given everything to a cause that, for all its triumph, had cost the world so much. When the war ended, a few of those workers saved small souvenirs, scraps of resin-coated paper, discarded fittings, or blueprints. One of these fragments, kept by a foreman for decades, now sits framed in a museum case, its surface yellowed but still faintly glossy. Visitors pass it by without realizing that the thin, fragile piece of material once carried the fuel that powered freedom's flight. The post-war years brought peace, but also reflection. Engineers began writing reports summarizing the lessons learned from wartime production. Many of those documents emphasized the importance of adaptability. They pointed to the paper fuel tank as a case study, an example of how unconventional thinking could yield revolutionary results. One report from 1946 called it a triumph of material economy and industrial imagination. Those words, though understated, captured the essence of what had been achieved. In the United States, too, the story was remembered by the men who had flown the Mustangs. At veteran reunions, it became a favorite tale to tell new generations. Pilots would describe the first time they saw those tanks being attached and how they joked about flying to Berlin on paper wings. Younger listeners would laugh until the veterans explained how serious it really was. "We trusted that paper more than anything," one pilot would say. "It carried us through hell." The P-51 Mustang itself went on to become one of the most celebrated aircraft in history, its design studied and admired for decades. But behind every technical triumph lies a hidden network of small innovations, each one essential to the whole. The paper tank was one of those invisible gears in the machine of victory. Without it, the Mustang's range would have been limited, its role diminished. The bombers would have suffered, and the war might have dragged on. Perhaps the greatest testament to the tank's success was that it was never replaced during the war. Despite rapid advances in aviation technology, there was no better alternative before Germany's defeat. Metal tanks remained too costly, rubber ones too fragile. Paper, paradoxically, proved the most reliable. It was the perfect compromise between endurance and disposability, strong enough for a mission, light enough to be cast away. Even after the war, engineers continued experimenting with paper-based composites. Bowater-Lloyd's experience inspired research into fiber laminates and resin-bonded materials. These early experiments eventually led to the birth of fiberglass, a material that would revolutionize industries from construction to aerospace. The paper tank in this way was not an endpoint but a beginning. It represented a moment when imagination bridged the gap between the old world of metal and the new world of synthetics. As decades passed, the few surviving tanks grew brittle. The resin coating yellowed, and the paper beneath it began to crumble. Conservators faced a challenge. How do you preserve something designed to be temporary? Some museums experimented with controlled humidity and temperature, others created partial replicas. But in many ways, the fragility of the tanks was part of their story. They were never meant to last. Their very impermanence spoke to their purpose, to exist just long enough to save a life, and then disappear. For the families of the men who flew with them, the story carried a quiet resonance. It reminded them that history is not only written in great battles or famous speeches, but also in the humble details that make those moments possible. A few ounces of resin, a roll of craft paper, a factory full of determined hands. These were the threads that wove victory. If you were to visit one of those old English airfields today, you might still find traces of that time. The runways, cracked and covered in grass, stretch out like ghosts of steel. The control towers stand empty, windows broken, their walls whispering with wind. And if you close your eyes, you can almost hear it. The roar of engines, the clatter of drop tanks, the distant hum of bombers heading east. Somewhere in that echo lives the spirit of the paper fuel tank, fragile, brave, and utterly unforgettable. The years following World War II were a time of rapid change and deep reflection. The nations that had fought so bitterly were rebuilding, and the technologies born from war were now shaping peace. Aviation in particular entered a golden age. Jet engines, pressurized cabins, and new materials transformed how people saw the sky. But somewhere behind all the sleek innovations and roaring progress, the story of a simple paper fuel tank still lingered, a quiet reminder that even the humblest invention could alter the course of history. For the WWII company, the transition back to civilian production was almost surreal. After years of making equipment that carried men into combat, the machines once again printed newspapers, packaging, and paper goods. The resin vats were drained, the molds dismantled, and the workers returned to familiar routines. But they were not the same. They had seen what their work could do. They had learned that paper, the simplest of materials, could become a vessel for something extraordinary. In many ways, that experience defined the company's spirit for decades to come. In the post-war era, WWII engineers continued experimenting with composite materials. They refined the resin coating process and adapted it for peacetime use. Waterproof containers, lightweight shipping drums, even experimental surfboards. The lessons learned from the paper tank proved surprisingly versatile. The company never forgot its wartime achievement, even as it faded from public consciousness. In their internal records, engineers referred to the technique as bow-water laminate construction, a nod to the project that had once seemed impossible. Meanwhile, in America, the P-51 Mustang entered a new chapter of service. It flew in Korea in the early years of the Cold War, and even in smaller conflicts around the world. Its range and speed continued to inspire aircraft designers. Every time it soared across the sky, it carried with it the echoes of that earlier era, the time when courage and creativity had stretched its wings farther than anyone thought possible. By the 1960s, a few aviation historians began to re-examine the technical archives of World War II. Among the thick folders of reports and blueprints, they stumbled upon detailed descriptions of the paper fuel tank project. Many were astonished. One British historian, writing in 1963, called it a masterpiece of practicality disguised as madness. He compared it to other wartime innovations that seemed absurd at first, like radar decoys made of foil strips or inflatable tanks used to deceive the enemy, and concluded that the paper tank belonged in the same category, genius born from necessity. As awareness of the project resurfaced, journalists began to interview surviving engineers and pilots. Old photographs were unearthed, black and white images of women at assembly tables, pilots inspecting the tanks before flight, and stacks of finished units ready for transport. One image in particular captured the imagination. A young woman brushing resin onto a curved sheet of paper, her face lit by a hanging bulb, concentration etched into her expression. The caption simply read, "Building the Wings of Victory." It was poetic, but it was true. The veterans who spoke about those days often described a sense of disbelief that something so small had made such a vast difference. Many remembered the exhaustion, the cold, the fear, and then the overwhelming relief of seeing friendly fighters still beside them as they turned home. They knew the tanks weren't glamorous, but they didn't need to be. They worked. That was enough. By the 1980s, several aviation museums in Britain and the United States began displaying restored P-51 Mustangs with replica paper tanks. Visitors were captivated. The contrast between the sleek, deadly aircraft and the rough, humble tanks beneath its wings was striking. Children would stare, trying to reconcile how something that looked so fragile could endure the fury of war. Guides would explain that the tanks were made of layers of craft paper bonded with phenolic resin, essentially the same kind of material used for household countertops decades later. The reactions were always the same, astonishment followed by respect. There's something profoundly moving about that contrast, about strength born from fragility. In many ways, the paper tank story is a metaphor for the entire Allied effort during the war. Ordinary people, using ordinary materials, came together to do something extraordinary. It wasn't always elegant, and it certainly wasn't always perfect, but it worked because it had to. The war demanded not perfection, but persistence. The Mustangs that flew those missions became legends, but they were never alone. Every sortie represented the labor of thousands, the workers who made the tanks, the mechanics who fitted them, the planners who calculated routes, and the pilots who trusted them. Each role mattered. Each contribution, no matter how small, helped carry the mission forward. The paper tank story is a reminder that history is not made only by those in the spotlight, but also by those whose work supports the wings of others. When engineers look back at the materials used during the Second World War, they often note how resource scarcity spurred creativity. The paper tank was a direct result of that pressure. Metal was needed for planes, ships, and weapons. Rubber was needed for tires and seals. Paper, however, was plentiful and underappreciated. The WWII engineers saw opportunity where others saw limitation. That shift in perspective, from scarcity to possibility, is what made the difference. In the decades since, that same philosophy has guided countless innovations. The drive to do more with less, to rethink materials, to turn simplicity into power, all of it traces its lineage back to wartime ingenuity. When modern engineers design carbon fiber aircraft components, lightweight drones, or recyclable composites, they're continuing a tradition that began with experiments like the paper tank. One might think the story ends there, but it doesn't. The legacy of the tank continued to ripple outward through education, engineering, and culture. In schools across Britain, the story was occasionally told as an example of British problem-solving. Teachers used it to inspire children to think creatively, to look at everyday materials in new ways. Remember the paper fuel tank, one teacher reportedly told his students. If paper can win a war, your ideas can change the world. For historians, the paper tank remains a fascinating case study in how wartime urgency compresses innovation. Projects that would normally take years to develop were completed in weeks. It was a period when bureaucracy bent under necessity, when imagination outran doubt. The success of the paper tank showed what could happen when people were allowed and encouraged to take risks. It became a story about freedom in design as much as freedom in war. And yet, for all its importance, the tank never claimed fame. There are no monuments to it, no memorials carved in stone. But perhaps that's fitting. Its creators never sought glory. They built it to serve a purpose and disappear. In that sense, the paper tank was like the men it served, brave, temporary, essential. As time marched on and the veterans grew older, their stories became all the more precious. The world was changing quickly. Space travel, computers, and new wars had transformed how people thought about technology and courage. Yet, when those old pilots and engineers gathered, they always returned to the same memories: the roar of engines, the smell of resin, the long shadows of dawn over English runways. They spoke not in grand terms of victory or strategy, but of the small, ingenious things that had made survival possible. And among those, the paper fuel tank always came up, an odd, endearing relic that still filled them with wonder. One of the last surviving engineers from WWII, interviewed in the early 1990s, smiled when he was asked how he felt about it all. It was just paper, he said, but it was paper with purpose. That simple phrase captured the essence of the story. The world had learned to turn ordinary things into tools of extraordinary power. To those who lived through it, the tank symbolized what human creativity could achieve under pressure, and what cooperation could build when fear was set aside. Meanwhile, the Mustang's legend only grew. Aviation enthusiasts restored old aircraft, painting them in the colors of famous squadrons. At air shows, the crowd's cheers would swell as the sleek silver fighters screamed overhead. But tucked under their wings, when the restorations were faithful to history, were those strange, bulbous auxiliary tanks, faithful replicas of the 108-gallon paper originals. Viewers might not know what they were seeing, but historians and veterans did. They knew that beneath that layer of resin and paper lay a piece of the ingenuity that had carried hope across the skies of Europe. For many veterans, seeing those replicas stirred powerful emotions. Some hadn't thought about the tanks in decades. They had moved on, raised families, built careers. But standing beneath a Mustang again, looking up at those familiar shapes, brought everything back. The cold wind before takeoff, the tension of the climb, the relief of spotting friendly wings still nearby after hours of flight. A few men cried quietly, their tears as much for the friends they'd lost as for the simple invention that had helped so many come home. Historians writing about the Allied bombing campaign often point out that technology alone doesn't win wars. It's the way people use it. The paper tank was a perfect example. It wasn't the most advanced piece of equipment, nor the most complex, but it changed how the war was fought. It gave commanders flexibility, gave pilots endurance, and gave bombers protection. It was, in every sense, a multiplier of courage. Without it, the strategic bombing of Germany might have remained an incomplete campaign. Its reach limited, its cost far higher. When you look at the broader picture of World War II innovation, you see a pattern emerge. The Allies succeeded not because they always had the best technology, but because they learned to innovate faster. They didn't get stuck chasing perfection. They chased solutions. The paper tank embodied that philosophy. It wasn't glamorous, but it was effective. It wasn't strong, but it was smart. It was the kind of invention that could only come from people who understood that the best answer isn't always the most obvious one. The Germans, for all their engineering prowess, often pursued overcomplicated designs, machines that were brilliant on paper but impossible to produce in large numbers. The Allies went the other way. They made things simple, scalable, and sufficient. A paper tank that worked was better than a metal one that took too long to build. That mindset, get it done, make it work, keep it moving, was what ultimately brought the war to an end. In the years after the war, the lessons of such innovation shaped peacetime industry. The same engineers who built paper tanks began developing materials for peacetime use: insulated packaging, protective coatings, lightweight construction materials. They carried forward the belief that creativity could solve any problem, no matter how absurd it seemed at first. Many of them would go on to say that the paper tank had been the defining experience of their careers. It had shown them what could be achieved when limits were turned into opportunities. Decades later, aerospace historians began to use the paper tank as an early example of disruptive design. They compared it to modern breakthroughs like 3D printing and carbon composites, technologies that challenged traditional ideas of strength and manufacturing. What those historians recognized was that innovation doesn't always mean building something new. Sometimes it means rethinking something old. The WWII team hadn't invented paper or glue. They had reinvented their purpose. There is also something deeply poetic about how the tank fits into the story of the Mustang itself. The aircraft was a collaboration between nations. The British requested it, the Americans built it, and together they refined it into perfection. It was an airplane born from partnership, and the paper tank was the final piece that allowed it to fulfill its destiny. Together they embodied the transatlantic unity that defeated tyranny. At its heart, though, this story is about people. The engineers who refused to give up after their first prototypes failed. The workers who spent endless hours in noisy, resin-soaked rooms, shaping and sealing every curve. The pilots who put their trust in an idea that sounded insane and found that it worked. And the countless others who played their small roles quietly, never realizing how great their impact would be. History often forgets such people, but their fingerprints are everywhere. In the designs, the missions, the survival of those who came home. There's a kind of poetic justice in the fact that something made from paper helped bring down a regime that had burned books and silenced words. The very material that carried truth and information across the world became a weapon of freedom. In that sense, the paper tank was not just an engineering triumph, but a symbolic one. It turned the instrument of communication into an instrument of liberation. Today, when engineers study the paper tank, they marvel at its simplicity and efficiency. Its construction used only a handful of parts. Its manufacturing required no rare materials. Its weight was perfectly balanced to maximize lift and minimize drag. Every detail was purposeful. It's a reminder that elegance in design often comes not from complexity, but from clarity of intent. The WWII engineers weren't trying to impress anyone. They were trying to solve a problem, and they did so with precision born of necessity. When you trace the threads of history, you see how even small innovations can ripple through time. The same logic that guided the paper tank, making the most of what's available, using materials intelligently, would later shape the environmental design movements of the 20th and 21st centuries. It's the same principle behind sustainable materials, recyclable packaging, and modular architecture. The echoes of that wartime creativity are still with us, disguised in peacetime progress. And perhaps that is the most enduring legacy of the paper fuel tank. It reminds us that progress isn't always loud or glamorous. Sometimes it's quiet, fragile, and fleeting, but its impact endures in the lives it saves, the ideas it inspires, and the worlds it helps to build. In the twilight of their lives, many of the people who had lived through those years took comfort in knowing that what they had built, however small, had mattered. The world had changed beyond recognition, yet the memories of those days remained vivid. The smell of resin, the hum of factory presses, the drone of aircraft engines fading into the distance. For them, the paper fuel tank was never just an object. It was a symbol of endurance, of cooperation, and of the belief that even the simplest materials could carry extraordinary weight when guided by purpose. When the subject of the paper tank appeared in post-war memoirs, it was always spoken of with affection. Pilots called it the lifeboat under the wing. Engineers referred to it as the miracle of Bowater, and factory workers, who had once hesitated to believe that paper could fly, later spoke with pride when they told their children that their hands had built something that reached all the way to Berlin. In a time when the world had been defined by destruction, it was a story of creation, a triumph of imagination over scarcity. The ingenuity behind it was something that resonated long after the war's end. Engineers in every field, from aviation to automotive design, took inspiration from the idea that lighter could mean stronger, that flexibility could mean resilience. In peacetime, that philosophy became a driving force behind advances in design and sustainability. It was no longer just about winning wars, it was about building smarter, more efficient worlds. Still, the image of those fragile paper tanks, soaring through frozen skies at hundreds of miles an hour, never lost its power to astonish. Historians who studied them often remarked on the strange beauty of it, a contradiction made real. How could something so delicate, so flammable, hold the fate of so many men? And yet, it did. Each flight was a calculated risk, a balancing act between faith in science and the sheer necessity of survival. For the pilots, that trust was earned through experience. The first time they used the tanks, they watched their fuel gauges nervously, half expecting disaster. But when the mission succeeded, when they returned with enough fuel to cross the channel and land safely, belief took root. From then on, those tanks became an accepted part of the aircraft, no longer a novelty but a trusted companion. In a war where every ounce of weight and every drop of fuel mattered, that trust meant everything. One veteran described the experience vividly. "You could always feel when it was time to drop them," he said. "The plane would get lighter, more responsive, like it was waking up. You'd pull the lever, and there'd be this moment, a little shudder, and then freedom. The tanks would tumble away, and we'd dive right into it. You never looked back." His words painted a picture not just of combat, but of the relationship between man and machine, a partnership built on ingenuity and courage. The paper tank wasn't perfect, of course. It had limitations. The resin coating could sometimes crack in extreme cold. Prolonged exposure to rain could cause warping. But those issues were minor compared to what it offered. Its simplicity was its genius. It didn't try to be invincible. It only had to last long enough. And in war, long enough was everything. In many ways, the story of the tank parallels the story of the men who flew with it. They were young, often barely trained, and yet they carried out missions that changed history. Like the tanks, they were resilient in their imperfection, fragile in body, unyielding in spirit. Both were made to endure for a short, crucial time, and both did exactly what was needed. After the war, as countries demobilized and life returned to normal, the paper tank quietly slipped into the background of history. But its legacy persisted in unexpected places. In 1947, Bowater engineers presented a lecture to a group of industrial designers about the wartime project. The audience was captivated. The presentation wasn't just about the tanks themselves, it was about what they represented: adaptability, efficiency, and courage in design. That lecture inspired a generation of engineers to think differently about materials and manufacturing. Decades later, when the aerospace industry began experimenting with honeycomb structures and composite fuselages, a few engineers noted that they were, in essence, perfecting what the Bowater team had pioneered: the art of layering strength from weakness. In that sense, the paper fuel tank had become a philosophical ancestor to modern aircraft construction. What began as an emergency measure had evolved into a blueprint for innovation. The human element, though, is what truly keeps the story alive. At commemorations and reunions, the veterans who still remembered those missions spoke not only of danger, but of gratitude, gratitude to the people they never met, whose hands had built those strange brown tanks. "You never thought about who made them," one pilot admitted, "but when you did, you realized someone had saved your life without ever knowing your name." It's a thought that still resonates today, a reminder of how deeply interconnected every act of service really is. Even the Luftwaffe, in their post-war analyses, acknowledged the strategic shift caused by the Mustang's extended range. Reports captured by Allied forces included remarks that enemy fighters now possess unlimited reach, and the American escort can penetrate all our defensive zones. Those dry words, buried in the archives, were the ultimate proof of success. Paper, in its own quiet way, had rewritten the air war. As the century turned and the war receded further into history, the story of the paper tank began to resurface once again. Documentaries, museum exhibits, and aviation historians gave it new life. It became a lesson in both engineering and humanity, a story about how innovation doesn't always come from brilliance alone, but from empathy, cooperation, and the stubborn will to survive. Modern visitors who walk through the hangars at Duxford or the Smithsonian sometimes stop in front of the Mustang displays, noticing the odd texture of the auxiliary tanks hanging beneath the wings. They lean in closer, read the descriptions, and blink in disbelief. "Paper," they murmur, as though trying to reconcile the impossibility of it, and then, as they step back and look at the shining aircraft above, they understand. They see not weakness, but genius, the strength of an idea that defied logic and yet carried men through the most perilous skies the world had ever known. For those who lived through the war, the memory of the Mustang's long flights to Berlin remained seared into their minds. But for later generations, it took time to understand what made those missions possible. By the time children of the 1960s and 1970s heard the tales from their fathers or grandfathers, the paper tank sounded like a fable, a quaint exaggeration from an era when the impossible seemed commonplace. But as historians began unearthing documents, photographs, and surviving fragments of those resin-coated shells, the truth proved even more remarkable than the legend. One of the more touching rediscoveries came in 1988, when a section of a paper tank was found buried near an old airfield in Norfolk. It had been jettisoned during a training flight and somehow avoided decay thanks to the resin coating. The fragment was warped and brittle, but the layered paper was still visible beneath the hardened surface. When it was displayed at a local museum, visitors couldn't believe that something so unassuming had once been part of a machine of war. School children reached out to touch it through the glass and whispered, "It looks like cardboard." Their teachers explained that, in a way, that's exactly what it was. Cardboard that helped win a war. That rediscovery reignited interest in the Bowater-Lloyd Company's wartime work. Surviving records revealed the staggering scale of production. Tens of thousands of tanks built and shipped across the country, tested and loaded onto Mustangs and Thunderbolts. Each one had to pass inspection, each one carried the same risk, and each one embodied the strange partnership between industry, science, and courage. It was industrial art, functional, ephemeral, and utterly necessary. At a time when the world was just beginning to appreciate environmental design and minimalism, the story of the paper tank struck a chord. Here was a design that had achieved everything modern engineers aspired to: efficiency, simplicity, recyclability, and purpose. It had been born not from abundance, but from limitation. That made it all the more inspiring. The war might have forced it into existence, but its lessons outlived the conflict by generations. In interviews from the 1990s, surviving pilots often remarked that the story of the paper tank deserved to be told more widely. They were humble men, rarely seeking recognition, but they felt the world should know about the ingenuity that had saved their lives. "We get remembered for the planes," one said, "but not for the people who gave those planes their reach." He wasn't just talking about engineers or factory workers. He meant everyone who had made the impossible possible. The cultural resonance of that story grew over time. It began appearing in documentaries and books not just as a technical innovation, but as a metaphor for resilience and creativity under fire. Authors described it as a triumph of fragility, an engineering whisper that roared, and the miracle of East Anglia. The idea that something so humble could shift the balance of power fascinated readers and viewers alike. It reminded them that progress doesn't always wear armor. Sometimes it wears paper. At Bowater-Lloyd, the legacy endured quietly. The company eventually merged into larger industrial groups, but employees kept the memory alive through archives and internal histories. Former workers who had been young apprentices during the war told the tale to their grandchildren. One elderly man, interviewed in his 90s, recalled the first time he saw a finished tank being rolled out of the curing shed. "It looked ridiculous," he said, laughing softly. "A big brown sausage made of paper. But then we heard how far the pilots could fly with it. We realized we'd made something special." It's easy, from the perspective of peace, to underestimate what desperation can create. The paper tank was a product of necessity, a solution born from constraint. And yet, within that constraint lay freedom. The engineers weren't bound by tradition or theory. They were free to experiment, to fail, to imagine. That freedom of thought is what made the tank possible, and it's what continues to make it inspiring today. In universities and design schools, professors occasionally cite the paper tank as a historical example of constraint-driven innovation. It's the idea that true creativity emerges when resources are scarce and problems urgent. Students are often amazed to learn that such a fragile material could endure the violence of high-speed flight. They study the chemistry of the phenolic resin, the layering techniques, the aerodynamics of the tank's shape. But more than the technical details, they study the mindset behind it, the willingness to see possibility where others see impossibility. That mindset is, perhaps, the most valuable inheritance from that era. The Second World War forced humanity to think differently about everything, not only weapons, but materials, logistics, and cooperation. Out of that crucible came inventions that reshaped the modern world: radar, jet propulsion, penicillin, the computer. The paper fuel tank stands among them, not as a weapon of destruction, but as an instrument of endurance, a way to reach farther without taking more. It also serves as a powerful reminder of the partnership between nations. The Allied victory was never the result of one country's genius alone, but of shared effort. Britain and America's collaboration on the Mustang and its auxiliary tanks exemplified that unity. In a war defined by division, it was proof that cooperation could be stronger than conquest. The paper tank was not just an engineering bridge, it was a human one. Even in the modern age where technology feels limitless, the story of the paper fuel tank holds a quiet relevance. It reminds engineers, artists, and thinkers that innovation doesn't depend on having everything. It depends on using what you have wisely. It's about daring to believe that a piece of paper, strengthened by imagination, can carry dreams across impossible distances. And so, as historians and filmmakers continue to revisit the air war over Europe, the story of the paper tank finds new audiences. It's told not only as a chapter of military history, but as a story of human creativity under pressure, a story about how courage and curiosity can change the course of history. In every retelling, one thing remains clear. The paper fuel tank may have been disposable, but its impact was anything but. It extended the range of aircraft, shortened the length of the war, and saved lives on both sides by hastening the conflict's end. It stands as a testament to the power of thought, fragile, fleeting, yet capable of carrying humanity farther than anyone thought possible. As the 21st century began, the paper fuel tank's story took on new meaning in a world once again facing challenges of resource scarcity, sustainability, and creativity under constraint. Engineers, historians, and filmmakers alike found themselves drawn to this forgotten marvel of wartime innovation, not just because of what it achieved, but because of what it symbolized. It wasn't merely a tale of military success. It was a parable about human potential, about how necessity can transform ordinary people into visionaries. In documentaries produced during the early 2000s, survivors who had been very young during the war, now frail, their voices trembling but proud, spoke of the moment when they first learned what the tanks had done. "I didn't think much of it then," one elderly woman said, who had worked at the Bowater Lloyd plant in her teens. "We just glued layers and brushed on resin. But later, when I saw the pictures of the Mustangs over Berlin, I realized I'd touched something that went there." Her eyes filled with tears. "Imagine that. My hands helped." That quiet pride resonated deeply with audiences. It reminded people that history is built not only by leaders and generals, but by millions of unseen hands, factory workers, engineers, logistics officers, and everyday laborers who believed in something bigger than themselves. The story of the paper tank was proof that greatness can come from anywhere, even from something as humble as paper. As scholars revisited the technical aspects of the design, they were struck by how forward-thinking it truly was. The tanks were made of laminated paper bonded with phenolic resin, a composite material that predated modern fiberglass by nearly a decade. The engineering reports showed remarkable precision in the layering process: 8 sheets of craft paper, each impregnated with resin, then molded, baked, and sealed. The result was light, strong, and, most importantly, cheap. It was a solution so perfect for its time that even modern engineers still admire its balance of practicality and performance. But the story wasn't only about science, it was also about courage. The pilots who flew with those tanks were risking their lives every time they took off. They knew the tanks could be punctured or ignited by gunfire, but they also knew that without them they couldn't reach their targets or protect their bomber crews. That choice, to trust innovation, to fly beyond the limits of the possible, is what turned an idea into a turning point. In many of the surviving accounts, that courage comes through in the smallest details. One pilot remembered flying through flak so dense it looked like black snow, hearing the rattle of debris against the fuselage. "I thought for sure the tanks had gone up," he said, "but they held. They always held. I don't know how paper could do that, but it did." His story, echoed by dozens of others, was a testament to both human and material endurance. Over time, the paper fuel tank came to represent more than just a technical achievement. It became a symbol of Allied unity and ingenuity. British engineers had found the idea. American industry had scaled it. Together, they had turned a desperate need into a shared triumph. In that sense, the tanks weren't just carrying fuel, they were carrying the very spirit of cooperation that defined the Allied war effort. Museums in both countries began to recognize the importance of preserving that legacy. The Imperial War Museum in London, the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum in Washington, and smaller aviation museums across Europe began creating exhibits dedicated to wartime innovation. The paper tank was often placed beside artifacts like radar screens, early jet engines, and code machines, a reminder that not every revolution roared. Some rustled softly, like pages turning in the wind. Visitors who encountered these displays often found themselves deeply moved. The tanks, with their simple brown surfaces and rough textures, looked out of place among gleaming aircraft and polished engines. But that contrast was what made them so powerful. Standing before them, people could feel the weight of history, the fragility of invention, the courage of trust, and the enduring truth that strength can come from the unlikeliest places. Educators began incorporating the story into their lessons on design thinking and problem solving. The phrase, "the paper tank solution," entered workshops and lectures as shorthand for thinking outside conventional boundaries. When faced with impossible constraints, the example reminded students to ask, "What do we already have that we're overlooking?" It was a question that had saved lives in 1944, and one that could still change the world today. The rediscovery of the paper tank's importance also led to renewed appreciation for the broader role of women in wartime engineering and manufacturing. At the Bowater Lloyd factory, as in so many wartime industries, women made up the majority of the workforce. They were the hands that laminated, sealed, and tested each tank. Their precision and dedication were critical to the tank's success, though few ever received recognition for it. When modern researchers tracked down the surviving workers, many were astonished to learn how vital their efforts had been. "We never knew," one woman said softly. "We just did our bit." As the 2010s approached, the story gained new life online. Aviation enthusiasts, history buffs, and engineers shared it across forums and social media, marveling at the idea that paper and glue had once changed the fate of nations. Videos and documentaries brought the story to new audiences, often pairing the technical explanation with archival footage of Mustangs roaring into the sky. Viewers from around the world found inspiration in it, a reminder that creativity knows no limits and that innovation often comes from the simplest of beginnings. But beyond all the technology and admiration, there was something deeply human about the tale that kept it alive. It wasn't just about extending range or reducing cost. It was about what people can achieve when they believe that the impossible is worth trying. It was about the courage to imagine, to look at an ordinary material and see possibility instead of failure. That spirit, that defiance of limitation, is what connects every generation of dreamers, from wartime engineers to modern innovators. And even now, when the story is told, in classrooms, museums, or online videos, there's always a pause, a moment when listeners stop and really think about it. Paper, glue, resin, flight. The mind tries to resist the idea, but the truth is undeniable. Those tanks were real. They carried men across the skies of war. They returned them home. And in doing so, they proved something eternal, that human creativity is the most powerful fuel of all. Today, when people look back at the story of World War II, they often focus on the grand strategies, the decisive battles, and the monumental machines that defined the era. The B-17s over Germany, the Spitfires over Britain, the Sherman tanks rumbling across Europe, these images dominate our collective imagination. Yet somewhere beneath all that noise, the quiet triumph of the paper fuel tank remains, as delicate and as powerful as ever. It's a story not of brute strength, but of brilliance. Not of domination, but of daring to imagine that something small, light, and fleeting could achieve what seemed impossible. In a world rebuilt around technology and convenience, it's almost impossible to grasp the desperation and creativity of that time. The men and women who made those tanks weren't working in gleaming laboratories or high-tech factories. They were using the tools of everyday life: rollers, brushes, glue pots, presses. They worked in buildings that once printed newspapers and packaging, not aircraft parts. Yet, through sheer determination, they transformed their craft into something extraordinary. It was a testament to what can happen when people stop asking, "Can it be done?" and start asking, "How do we make it work?" For the Allied pilots, those paper tanks became more than equipment. They became lifelines. Every mission that pushed deeper into Germany carried risk beyond calculation. Every pilot who made it home owed part of that return to the strange light brown pods that hung beneath their wings. They knew that without those tanks, the bombers would have flown alone, exposed and unguarded, and thousands more lives would have been lost. For them, the invention was not just clever. It was salvation made tangible. And so, when veterans told their stories to their grandchildren decades later, they spoke not only of courage and combat, but also of gratitude. Gratitude for the unseen hands that had worked in quiet factories across England. They wanted people to remember that behind every flight, there were thousands of small acts of faith and ingenuity. They wanted the world to know that victory was not just won by those in the sky, but also by those who stayed on the ground, building the fragile things that made endurance possible. In that way, the story of the paper tank is not just about war, it's about humanity. It's about what people can achieve when they refuse to accept limits, when they dare to believe that even the impossible can be built from the simplest materials. It's a lesson that outlived the conflict itself and continues to echo across time. The same spirit that turned paper and glue into a weapon of survival still drives scientists, engineers, and dreamers today. Whenever someone looks at a problem and says, "There must be another way," they are, in spirit, continuing the legacy of Bowater Lloyd. At its core, this story is about transformation. A newspaper factory became an aircraft supplier. Paper became armor. Fragility became strength. And through that transformation, the course of history was changed. The paper tank didn't just extend the Mustang's range, it extended humanity's belief in its own capacity to adapt and overcome. It showed that innovation isn't limited to those with resources, it belongs to those with imagination. Even now, more than 80 years later, the few surviving tanks, or fragments of them, rest in museum cases, their resin surfaces dulled by time. They are quiet things, easy to overlook. But if you stand before one long enough, you begin to sense the magnitude of what it represents. You can almost hear the hum of the old presses, the murmur of the workers, the distant echo of engines fading toward the horizon. You realize that you are looking at something that once carried courage itself across the sky. For the modern world, obsessed with efficiency and technology, the lesson is both humbling and hopeful. It reminds us that true innovation is not about complexity or perfection. It's about creativity born from necessity. It's about looking at the materials within reach and finding new ways to use them. When metal was scarce, paper became a savior. When time was short, imagination filled the gap. That same principle can guide us now in times of crisis or change, as surely as it did in 1944. There is also something profoundly poetic about the idea that the written word, the same paper that once carried news, stories, and ideas, was transformed into something that carried men through war. In a sense, those tanks were flying pages of human invention, turning communication into propulsion, turning thought into action. They embodied the best of what humanity can be: creative, cooperative, and endlessly adaptable. Every time a restored Mustang takes off today, its engine thundering across the sky, it carries that story with it. The pilots who fly them at air shows often speak about the reverence they feel, not just for the aircraft, but for the era of innovation and sacrifice it represents. Beneath the roar of the Merlin engine, they say there's a whisper, the whisper of paper against wind, of imagination taking flight. In the end, that may be the most enduring image of all. Paper, light and fragile, carrying fire and steel across a continent. It defies logic, and yet it happened. It reminds us that the boundaries of the possible are not fixed. They are drawn by courage, erased by creativity, and redrawn by those who dare to ask, what if? So when we speak of the great inventions of the Second World War, radar, the jet engine, the codebreaker's machine, we should also remember the simplest one, the paper fuel tank. It was not glamorous, it was not loud, and it was never meant to last. But it did exactly what it needed to. It carried hope through the clouds, and it brought men home. And perhaps that's the perfect ending to its story. Not a grand monument or a famous name, but a legacy of quiet genius, a reminder that even the most fragile ideas can fly, and that sometimes victory comes not from steel and fire, but from paper and glue. The war it helped to win is long over. The factories have fallen silent. The men who flew and the women who built have mostly passed into memory. But the idea, the simple, extraordinary idea that paper could carry courage, endures. It drifts through time like the echo of an engine over distant fields, soft but unforgotten. Because in the end, that little tank made of paper did more than extend range. It expanded possibility. It showed that imagination is the true engine of progress, and that even in the darkest moments of history, human creativity can find a way to fly.